When Burke was born, he was the apple of his parents' eyes. He could do no wrong. He got the full treatment of gifts and clothes and trips and you name it. But then when JonBenet came along, and especially as she got older, that attention that Burke had switched from him to JonBenet.
Besides the Ramsey housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, and the Ramsey gardener, Brian Scott, probably the best person who had the best access to the Ramseys was photographer Judith Phillips. As you're about to hear, Judith's exposure to the Ramseys was multidimensional because she didn't just document Patsy's cancer journey and JonBenet's pageant journey, but she also played on the same softball team as Patsy and Susan Stein. And Judith's own daughter was sometimes invited into JonBenet's room and Burke's room as well. Now, in terms of the clip you just heard, which comes from the CBS documentary that was sued for $750 million, someone didn't want you to hear this. Notice how Judith identifies a specific inflection point. When did Burke's perfect world suddenly change? When was it suddenly and unexpectedly disrupted by an intruder? Well, when JonBenet was born. Do you notice when trying to explain just how Burke's world sort of regressed and contracted and changed? And remember, both the housekeeper and the gardener described Burke as kind of quiet, kind of sticking to himself. And I think Judith Phillips does as well. But when she tries to explain Burke's world and how it changed, she prioritizes gifts first. You know, when she describes JonBenet's brother receiving the full treatment, well, the gifts come first in terms of that conveyor. Now, if there is some sort of rivalry going on or some sort of competition for scarce parental attention, you can imagine events like birthdays and Christmas are going to be a bigger deal than for other children. You know, so that rare occasion when the parents are present, when the children are being spoilt with more attention than usual. I know when I had birthdays, my parents sometimes gave my siblings little token gifts so that they wouldn't feel left out, and vice versa. Which is why I think if you could magically take the Christmas of 1996 out of the equation, JonBenet would still be alive today. I think if you take Christmas out of the equation and you take the pageants out of the equation, JonBenet would still be alive. It's also prescient of the Ramsey photographer to note that this issue with attention got worse, was aggravated as JonBenet got older. So how would JonBenet getting older change this dynamic between brother and sister? How and why would it change? Well, because it was in the last 2 years of her life that JonBenet started doing pageants. And of course, Burke was never going to be Miss America.
But then when JonBenet came along, and especially as she got older, and her destiny was to be in the pageant system, that attention that Burke had switched.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. I hope you're having a good weekend wherever you are. Now you can imagine on those occasions where Burke had to go along to JonBenet's rehearsals, and even worse, watch her performing in pageants, then he was really relegated to the audience, to a mere spectator in a crowd of spectators. Think about it, JonBenet is on stage and he isn't. Everyone is cheering and supporting and loving JonBenet, and he's supposed to do the same. He's supposed to cheerlead his sister as well. And all of this while his parents sit beside him and they are crowing, oohing, ahhing, while she's explicitly on stage, right? And she's overtly now the center of attention. She's not just the center of attention at home, but she's overtly the center of attention kind of in the outside world as well. And of course, when she's the center of attention, he isn't. He wasn't. Now, it's easy to minimize this in terms of your own experience. And so many people who follow the Ramsey case try to see it or do see it through their own relationships with their parents and their siblings. And you might say, maybe sometimes siblings get more attention, and maybe it wasn't a big deal to you. But that's not the question. It's not about what it felt like to you. It's how it felt to be JonBenet, and how it felt to be Burke, and what it felt like to have Patsy as a mother, and what John was like to have as a dad, a busy businessman. The pageant thing also wasn't just a pageant thing. This was an effort to make JonBenet in the image of her own mother and two aunts. So there's not just one pageant queen in the story, there are three. So that's 3 times the amount of pressure and fussing and all of that kind of thing going on. The poor ladies had all become Miss West Virginias, and now it was JonBenet's turn. Burke wouldn't be getting a turn, all 3 of the poor ladies, Patsy and her sisters, Pam, and I think Polly, they'd all gone on to compete in Miss America. And who knows, perhaps JonBenet could actually win the darn thing someday. Okay, well, what about Burke? What's he going to be doing? The other thing that perhaps made this dynamic quite a tough deal for a little kid was this idea of John being often absent. So you're left in the situation where a mother is fussing about pageants all the time. What's the little boy going to do in this equation? Is he going to feel wanted? Now, I doubt whether John was into the pageant thing as much as Patsy, even if he was occasionally there with his video camera and supportive of the little girl when he was there. But what this means, these absences that were so frequent, and we certainly get a sense of that from the gardener, that John was absent so often that, according to the gardener, JonBenet even cried about it. I miss my dad. Well, what does this mean? It means that when John's away, Patsy's undivided attention, that's if and when it was undivided, went to who? And again, I don't think it's the end of the world if you don't get a lot of attention, but I think it can be quite devastating if you did get a lot of the attention, if you were the apple of someone's eye. And then not only do you recede in your status, not only does that fall away, but someone else actually replaces you. And I think when you don't have a lot of emotional resources, you don't have that whole arsenal of emotional skills to see this in perspective, in context, you don't have that kind of maturity, it might feel overwhelming. It might feel also devastating.
And so to look for him is to be looking for a means to do what?
And this scene where Neo, who thought he was the one, goes to the Merovingian, you also get a sense of him being completely invalidated. He's entering a dynamic that he seems powerless and helpless to do anything about. It's not a very nice feeling.
How did he react to that?
Before we get to the rest of this analysis, just a big thank you to all the supportive and encouraging comments I got in the previous video. It means a lot. Thanks a lot. Interestingly, at the same time, there's been an effort to make South Africans qualify for refugee status, certainly some of them, in America. By the way, if you'd like to skip the book review punt that's about to come up and get to the point of this whole video where Judith shares her theory, skip right now to the last minute of this video. I wouldn't want you to waste your time. Okay, so thanks to Jonna L for leaving this review yesterday on Christmas Star. Critical thinking and synthesis matter, the JonBenet Ramsey case. I thought I knew a great deal about the JonBenet Ramsey case. However, after reading this book and watching Nick's YouTube channel, I have learned much more than I thought possible. And then there are also references to emphasizing critical thinking and synthesis, and how this sometimes feels like a college course in how and why it's important to think about this, not only in terms of this case, but also in life. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Now, for those who didn't skip ahead to the end, and kudos to you if you didn't, like I said, I'm here to try to understand what happened and how it happened. And you know what? That takes time. You don't just jump to the end. That might give you some information, but doesn't really explain the how and the why and the what and the who. So I'm less interested actually in the who. And so when you do this, when you go through this process, you recognize what is happening, whatever it was. And what you see is that a process was taking place. What do I mean by that? Well, how about this? At the same time something was happening to JonBenet, something else was happening to someone else. At the same time, someone was being validated, someone else wasn't, or at least they felt like they weren't. And again, this isn't about how you feel and how validated you felt by your parents or by your siblings or invalidated. This is about these siblings, how they felt in their situation, in their dynamic. Now, in this respect, let's head to an incredibly forthright interview Judith Phillips gave to Mary McCardle Soomer. It's an audio interview that took place in February 2000. In other words, flush after the apparent exoneration of the Ramseys. Some people thought that that meant that they were free and clear, but other people still had their concerns. And so this is what came up in an interview titled Afternoon with Judith Phillips, Photographer. And although there's a lot to take in here, we're only going to look at 3 insights from several from Judith Phillips, starting with A, the pageantry JonBenet experienced wasn't ordinary or average. And I think this is kind of a big mistake that a lot of people make, is they say, JonBenet was in pageants, so what? No, not so what. JonBenet wasn't just in ordinary pageants, and the amount of pageantry that JonBenet was doing. I mean, in some of the outfits, she looks like she's appearing in Rio, like that festival. And so Judith describes a photo shoot she did involving not only JonBenet but Burke as well. Burke was also there. So she says the following: of course I saw the physical changes with her hair, and that she was dressed up like at a Christmas party where she was dressed up in the Cinderella ball gown. I'd never seen her in clothes like that. I hadn't seen that before. And she was so perfectly coiffed, makeup. And when I did the photo shoot in the studio, the one where she and her mom and Burke and Nidra were there, I saw her. Really, I left it up to the people to decide, how they wanted to present their family. What is quite interesting is you see them all standing to attention like this military family. And remember, John did come from a military background. And so Judith says, I didn't say you had to wear these kinds of clothes. And so I was always very interested to see what mothers would bring to wear. And look how Burke is dressed in a suit, mother and daughter in matching hats. There's a kind of almost a sense of royalty about how they're looking. And JonBenet kind of mischievously has a kind of a salute. To me, it's not a salute, it's more attention. Yes, tell us what we need to do. But you've got to wonder, behind those appearances, what was really going on in Patsy's heart and mind? What was Burke feeling when he had to do this? How did JonBenet feel? It was probably kind of fun for her. And what was the matriarch like to be with, Nidra? In a sense, I think Patsy was created by her mother, to be the way that she was. What kind of person was Nidra? And that brings us to B. Patsy was in a frenzy. Judith provides a fascinating psychological insight into Patsy here, doesn't she? There's the sense that, when Patsy was on CNN, saying, there's someone out there. And Patsy on the 911 call, it was often the same Patsy everywhere, frantically dealing with something. That Patsy was kind of stressed. And so Judith says here, no, I did not see the stress of JonBenet at all. I didn't get the sense that JonBenet was under any stress. Now, that doesn't mean that JonBenet wasn't, just that Judith didn't notice it. Of course, JonBenet cried at the Christmas party on the 23rd. Anyway, she says, and I don't know, to me, she looks quite stressed in the very last photo of JonBenet, where, at the Whites, where I think JonBenet even ate by herself. But anyway, what I saw in that photo shoot, Judith says, which was really the last time, the second last time I saw her live, was that Patsy was in a frenzy. And so this is also coming very close to the time when all of this happened. And that's important, that Patsy seemed flustered and in a frenzy, that she was late as usual, and she probably had another appointment that she was already late for. So it was, come on, get going. And you can imagine the way that she was flustered, and I think the same way she's treating the photographer, she's probably treating her children, and she says, when I took the pictures, especially of JonBenet alone, I allowed her to be free and to be herself on some level. And she said it was difficult for JonBenet to handle that. She was used to being kind of ordered around. And so she says that Patsy was real tense and the kids were like real stiff and real obedient to her, and they knew not to cross a certain line. So it seems like Patsy's kind of reaching a kind of a threshold. Why is Patsy so stressed? And this portrait does give one a sense that perhaps behind closed doors, the children might be quite stressed by their mother, and perhaps one child more than the other. And this overall sense of stress, wasn't this leading to bedwetting? And so the photographer, to her credit, actually captures the stiffness in this portrait where all four are kind of standing to rigid attention. And that brings us to C. Police asked Judith about women John knew. Does that mean that they suspected affairs? Now, there has never been any absolute evidence in this regard, but one can imagine if John was away a lot, even if he wasn't having an affair, Patsy was possibly stressed about this aspect, possibly suspecting something. Why is John always away? Perhaps something like Shanann Watts was towards the end of her life. And perhaps Patsy was justifiably stressed, perhaps not, who knows. Anyway, Patsy's asked, I think in April, not sure, March or April, when did the police speak to you? And she says, and did you ask to be spoken to? Like, did you voluntarily come forward? Judith says, they called me first and asked if it would be okay if they could interview me down at police headquarters. And I said, sure. And I think this is March or April. So this is possibly in advance of the Ramseys giving their first interview. Judith is asked, did the police want to know about what type of person Patsy was? And Judith says, well, they interviewed me 3 times, and the first was short, and Steve Thomas and Gossage was there, and there was a woman whose name I don't recall. Maybe it was Gretchen Smith, maybe it was Jane Harmer, maybe it was Linda Arendt. And she says, those were the 3 that interviewed me. It was taped, and I didn't have a problem with that at all. They asked odd questions like, do you know this person as related to John Ramsey? They were naming off at least half a dozen female names, and no, I've never heard of that person before, and no, I've never heard that person before. And so she's asked, were these relatives, or how were they connected to John? And so Judith says, yeah, woman involved with John. They were hinting, the police were hinting at an affair. And I said, why did you ask me the names of these women? And they said, well, it's believed that John Ramsey had quite a few affairs, not only in Atlanta, but also here in Boulder. Do you know of anything? And she said, I knew really none. So in terms of that, maybe it's something that the police suspected, but weren't able to prove. And maybe they were wrong to suspect that. Anyway, it's interesting that Judith says this. She says, John has such a devious quality about himself, there was no way that he would let anybody know about his trysts, whether they were real or not. Now, this seems to be Judith saying, I actually don't know whether he was having an affair. Anyway, she says, I found it interesting, the line of the police line of questions and how it went. Then they asked me if I knew about Patsy, if I saw her angry, if I saw her lose her temper, and if I knew if she had ever had any relationships here in Boulder, questions like personality type questions. And so what does Judith end up saying about anger and losing temper? Who seems to be doing that?
I think he had Burke had a bad temper. It's like he had a chip on his shoulder.
Now, if it's true that attention switched to his sister, isn't it likely that he would have a chip on his shoulder? Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. There are a lot more insights to draw from Judith Phillips. She's also a very fascinating personality, an individual related to this case. So if you'd like me to dive even deeper, let me know in the comments. Meanwhile, what did Judith Phillips share on CBS regarding her theory?
Patsy, at the time when I was photographing them, what the scar was, she said that the kids were playing and Burke lost his temper and hit her with a golf club.
Is this statement true, though, or is it the photographer who's perhaps got a gripe because she's no longer within the Ramsey friendship circle? Or is she telling the documentarians exactly what they wanted to hear? Because both John and Patsy claim that that was an accident, and Burke, when he was asked the same thing on Dr. Phil, said the same.
Did you feel left out of that, or was that okay with you?
No, it was totally fine. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my mom, too.
So how did Burke respond when he was asked about this incident?
So the lead investigator thinks you're the culprit because you had previously been violent with JonBenet. Had you ever violently attacked your sister?
No.
Did you hit your sister with a golf club?
And he, you know, he was out there with the little wiffle ball, golf ball, you know. And she walked up behind me about that time and he clipped her right on the cheek.
Okay.
And she screamed bloody murder.
Did you hit your sister with a golf club?
Not on purpose. She was standing behind me and I went like that.
It's interesting that Patsy says that JonBenet screamed bloody murder. Isn't that the same kind of scream that Melody Stanton heard? Now, what's extraordinary about this statement from the photographer, if it's true, is it suggests 7 things. 1, that Patsy knew Burke had hurt JonBenet previously. Number 2, that it was deliberate and not accidental. Patsy said it was accidental, but the photographer understood it as deliberate. Number 3, that Burke had a temper, again the way the photographer understood it. Number 4, that Burke struck JonBenet with an object. Number 5, that the injury was significant enough to cause a scar, and that presumably that required medical treatment, stitches, and surgery. In other words, it was a significant injury. Number 6, that the injury was to the same place, JonBenet's head, where JonBenet was apparently fatally struck on Christmas night. And then number 7, that this incident apparently occurred while, quote, kids were playing, unquote. It's possible that Judith misheard, or over time her memories kind of gotten clouded, or she just doesn't remember clearly what Patsy said. It's possible, I guess, also that she simply made it up. I mean, if Patsy had the choice of telling Judith what happened and saying it was an accident, why not the latter? Well, one answer could be the length and depth of Patsy's friendship with Judith, and they were friends who went way back. And Patsy might confide these things to an insider who was already familiar with everything anyway. But you can't get into that if you want to skip ahead and get to the point, can you? Anyway, the answer to a lot of this confusion and speculation about Burke, what he said, what he felt, what he did, seems to be that Burke ought to tell us directly. Burke ought to tell us firsthand. But we know how that turned out, don't we?
It's sort of surprising that Burke gave up his anonymity.
And I think in retrospect, it was probably a mistake. I don't think he came across that well, even though he's totally innocent.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.